Chapter 5 Night Officers moved among the men, and told them what every man knew was a lie, told them they'd done well, had stood up to rebel fire, and given it back. But even Charlie knew, and he thought he knew nothing, that they'd been whipped from the field. They'd been ordered to cross a meadow and take the hill, and the Confederates had torn them to pieces, made them withdraw in good order, made them run. But the officers moved through the trees and told them lies, and said to rest because they would have to go back tomorrow, would regroup and move against the rebels in the morning, and Charlie thought it was like trying to tell water to run uphill. There was nothing on God's earth that would allow his legs to move his body against that fire again. Not a man, he thought, not a man would be alive halfway across that meadow. He lay by a tree and watched fireflies move over the battlefield. They were pretty, flitting here and there, and for a moment he could believe that none of it had happened. The firing was done now, the only sound the moaning of the wounded. The rebels were back in their woods, resting just as Charlie was, and the pretty fireflies were fluttering around the field over the dead. Then Charlie realized they weren't fireflies, but lanterns. They were lanterns and candles. Men from both sides were going from body to body in the dark, looking for dead friends, for wounded comrades, and he thought of men he knew who were out there, Massey and the lieutenant, but decided it would serve no purpose to go out there and see it all again. They were dead. He'd seen them die. Massey didn't have a head, and the lieutenant didn't have a brain or heart or much of anything else, and short of digging a hole and burying them, he didn't know what he could do for them. Or for me, he thought. I don't know what I could do for me. He watched the lanterns and the candles and tried to feel sad for the dead and wounded, tried to feel some pain for them, but he could feel nothing but a bone tiredness that left his hands shaking and his legs weak and his stomach churning. Drink water, someone whispered in the darkness. It sounded like another officer's voice. You all must drink water if you can. Hold it down. Try to get some sleep. Men will pass among you with rations. Somebody came out of the dark and handed him a piece of half-dried bread and cold, raw salt pork. He nearly threw the food away, but took a small bite of the bread and was immediately ravenously hungry. He wolfed down the bread and ate the raw pork, surprised that it stayed in his stomach. He drank water until his stomach was full and his canteen empty, then let his back slide down the tree until he was sitting with his legs outstretched. His head nodded and bobbed, and he dozed, fought sleep, then dropped off again until his chin rested on his chest, and he was sleeping. Check your weapon! Somebody was shaking him, and he opened his eyes and felt as stiff as an old man. It seemed just moments had passed, but he raised his head and saw a faint grayness in the east. Clean your weapon and check your load. Refill your cartridge boxes and get more caps. Fill your canteen from the stream back 20 yards and get ready. We move with good light. Charlie stood and walked to a small creek. It took only moments to hold his canteen beneath the surface and let it fill, and take several long drinks from the brook and wash his face. But in that time the light grew brighter, and he saw that the water wasn't clear. It was tinged with pink, and he saw bodies in the water upstream. This time he wanted to vomit, but it would not come. The food felt like a stone in his stomach, and the bloodied water seemed to sour it, curdle it, but it wouldn't come up, even when he stuck his fingers down his throat. Clean your weapon, Private. A sergeant from another part of the regiment, one he did not know, came up to him and pointed to his rifle. There'll be plenty of time for puking later. Get ready. We're going against them again in just a few minutes. Later he would know things about fighting. It was silent now, and that meant that troops had not joined battle yet. Meant that there might not be a fight. But he did not know this yet, and the sergeant's order made him so afraid it was as if a shaft had gone through him, had stopped his heart. He had never really thought they would make him cross the meadow again. But here it was, against him. He looked to where they had been yesterday and saw the lumps that were bodies. Here and there a wounded man lying all night on the ground moved and made a small sound, but mostly they were still. I'll be there soon, he thought. I'll be there on the ground with them. If I don't run away, I'll be there like a broken doll. We all will. None of us can live if we walk out there again. But he could not run away. None of the others had, and he couldn't. He cleaned his rifle carefully. He had not loaded it after firing the previous afternoon, and he used a bit of rag and water to clean out the powder residue, then took oil from a small bottle he carried and oiled the bore and wiped it dry with the piece of rag he carried wrapped around the bottle. All done automatically without thinking. The training must work, he thought. I'm doing all this without meaning to do it. He felt like a stranger to himself, like the other person watching his hands move over the rifle, wiping and cleaning. When it was clean, he snapped 3 caps on the nipple to burn any oil out of the nipple hole, then took a cartridge from his cartridge box, bit the end of the paper off, poured the powder down the bore, set the bullet down on top of it, and pushed it into place with the ramrod. When the bullet was seated, he cocked the hammer, pinched a cap so it would stay wedged on the nipple, and eased the hammer down to half cock. Ready. For a moment there was nothing to do, so he started to sit by the tree again, but then the sergeants came. Everybody form line of battle, out here, form on me. And Charlie's legs moved again, carried him out, and he hated them for it, but they worked and took him into the grass to stand with all the other men who still lived. Form on me, in a line of battle, right here. A sergeant he did not know was pointing with an officer's saber to where they should stand. The men moved as told, stood in their line, and Charlie stood with them. Fix bayonets! Charlie pulled the bayonet from his scabbard at his side and locked it on the muzzle of his rifle. Another delay. It was a clear morning, no clouds, the sun just up, and he could see other units forming. How could they, he thought. How could they just form and stand there waiting for it after yesterday? How could I? It had all started this way yesterday. March out and form up. Except that yesterday there were congressmen and other families on the hill, come out from Washington in buggies to picnic and watch the battle. And hadn't they got more than they bargained for? All those petticoats flying and the carriages rocking along as they found that rebel shells did not care if you were a soldier or a civilian. The Union troops had marched the same as today and formed the same line of battle, and the Rebs had brought the fire and steel of God down on them. Forward! The sergeant turned and started marching across the field, just as he had done yesterday, heading for the piles of dead men they'd left yesterday, walking in a measured pace, and the men followed, their rifles held at port arms, ready to be raised. Watch the trees, the sergeant yelled. Keep your eyes on the trees. That, Charlie thought, was the most unnecessary command he had ever heard. Charlie couldn't keep his eyes off the trees. His mind, his breath, his very being watched the trees. The trees where his death would come from. They walked in line across the meadow, through their own dead from the day before. Charlie tried not to look down at them, but couldn't help it, and found that they all looked alike. He could not identify men he'd known for months. They were all bloated, pushing out against their uniforms. Clouds of flies were planting eggs in the wound openings and eyes in the mouth of the bodies. The smell was sweet, cloying, and smell of blood and dirt and decaying flesh, the smell of death. They had uniforms on, red flannel shirts, so he knew they were all Minnesota men, but the dead all looked alike, broken, like broken toys or dolls. The troops were through the dead now, still walking, past the smell. There. He thought he saw movement in the trees. 100 yards now, 99, 98. Every step a yard. Another step, another man stepping next to him. There. Some rustling leaves. He was sure of it. Movement. They'd open fire soon. Any second, it would come from the trees. The snarl and smoke and death would come from the trees, from the leaves. Any second. Now. Now. Now! Why don't they shoot? What are they waiting for? Every breath his last. Every sound his last. Every sight his last. It would come now. God, oh God, now. It did not come. They walked in line to the rebel earthworks and found the enemy gone. The Rebs had pulled out during the night, left food on the fires, water in pails, just left it all. Charlie studied the earthworks, logs stacked up with dirt piled in front and small ledges for the men to stand on and shoot without exposing more than their heads. He could have shot at them for years and never hit them, Charlie thought. He could have died shooting at them and never touched them. He took a deep breath and let it out, his first whole breath since he had started walking across the meadow, and looked down and was shocked to see that he'd wet himself. Across the meadow, he thought, I must have done it then. Walking through the bodies, maybe then. He couldn't remember doing it, could only remember the fear. It stopped his breath, made him almost want to die, and it must have been then. He started to hide himself, turn away, but he saw that he was not alone, that several other men had done the same thing. First battle.